Welcome to Donzi Tech. In this tutorial, we are going to look at the forms module and then how it works with the Angular. We'll also be looking at how we can do form validations using the template-driven approach for the Angular. We also look at reference variables and how we can use it inside our templates for our Angular project. So to get started with this, I'm just going to start with a new Angular project instead of working with previous ones, so that if you are new to this channel or to Angular, you can also follow along with this. Alright, so I'm just going to navigate to the folder here. So I already have a folder created Angular, so this is the folder I'll be working with. So you can just open that Angular folder or any other folder you have on your desktop you prefer to work with. And then you click here, then you type cmd. So now when you do this, it's just going to open the Angular folder inside your terminal. But then if you're also comfortable with your terminal, you can just navigate from your desktop into your Angular project. So let me quickly just demonstrate that. So if you're on Windows, you just do Windows R and you type cmd. So this will just open your terminal for you, and then by default you are going to see your username here. So you just do cd desktop. So you are now on your desktop. So if you have any folder on your desktop you want to navigate to, you just do cd the folder name. So I have Angular on my desktop, so cd Angular. Okay, so it's the same approach. So you can just go through the steps I just demonstrated, or you can simply click here then type cmd. You'll also get the same output. All right, so inside here I'm going to create my Angular project. So to create a new Angular project, you just use ngNew followed by the name of the project. So let me name this form validation. And then I'm going to skip the installation of the node modules. But then if this is your first Angular project, it's advisable you install the node modules, else you're going to run into issues. Right, so the node modules are needed by the Angular project to just keep running. So skip install is just used to skip the installation of the node modules. And then you also have to make sure you are connected to the internet before you can install your Angular project. All right. So skip install is just used to skip the installation of the node module. So enter here. So if you're going to have routing in your Angular project, you can just choose the Y, but then I always choose Y for my project. You can always use the arrow keys up and down to choose your preferred style sheet. So let me just use CSS here. So because I skipped the installation of the node modules, it's going to just speed up the process. So CLS to just clear the screen. Okay. So now when you go back to your Angular project or whatever folder you created your project in, you are going to have the new project here, form validation. But inside this project, we don't have anything called node modules. Okay. So I will need to copy it from my previous project and then paste it there. Okay, so copy and then paste here. But if this is your first time, you don't have to add the skip install. Alright, so while this copies, I'm just going to navigate to the form validation folder and then open it with my VS Code. Okay, so I'll just do cd the form validation folder. Alright, so if you're on Windows, it doesn't consider the case you used. Okay, so clear the screen. So if you're on VS Code, you just do code dot, and this will open the VS Code with the folder you have here, form validation. Okay, so when you just run the code dot, you just open your VS Code with the folder or the directory you are currently in, which is the form validation. Alright, so with this, I'm not going to be creating any component. I'll just be working with the default app component created by the Angular. Okay, so in the SRC folder, you have app. So inside the app, that's where you have all the files you'll be needing for your Angular project. So if you want routing, because ES was selected when the project was being created, you have the Angular routing here. And then this is the CSS file for this HTML. And then it has a testing file just for unit testing. Then you have the TS file for the logic for this component, and then app.module.ts, where any module or library you are using, you have to import that there. Okay, so we are going to be importing one module here. That's the forms module. So here I'll just let me go back to this. So when you expand your app folder, you have app.module.ts. So I will just import the forms module here. So import and then forms module. Alright, so for the Angular, there are two ways you can create forms. You can use the reactive forms or the template-driven forms. Okay, so when you import the forms module here, you can add it to your import. So forms module. So that's how we do that. So you can choose to bring the comma here or skip. It wouldn't give you any error. Okay, so inside the forms, inside the app.component.html, I'm going to delete the default HTML here. And then I'll also be using Bootstrap for this video so that I don't have to write a lot of CSS. Okay, so for the Bootstrap, I'll be using MD Bootstrap, not the Get Bootstrap website. But I can also use the same thing and it will work for you. So you can search for MD Bootstrap. That's the material design for Bootstrap. So MD Bootstrap. Okay, so when you search for MD Bootstrap, you can use the first website, or you can simply also type the URL in your address bar. Okay, so you can just expand this, and then you expand the getting started here. Then you click on installations. So on the installation, you can scroll down to where we have CDN. So we'll copy their CSS and then we also copy their JavaScript file. So now this is where we'll be adding it. In your Angular project, we have one HTML file here, index.html. So this is where all your components will be coming through. So we have your app root here. That's the default component created by the Angular. Alright, so I can add this here, or I can also choose to npm install the MD Bootstrap so that it will automatically be added to your module. But then to keep the video simple, I'm just doing it this way. Okay, then you can also copy the JavaScript file here and then you paste it here. You can also choose to keep it inside the head tag, it wouldn't give any errors. So I'm just pasting it below here. So you can just close this off. So you make sure you paste it inside the index.html file. That's the file here. So I can just close this off. So we are done with the node modules. I can close that also off. Alright, and then inside here, let me just create a container. Let me hide this. So this container, I'm going to add a bootstrap class called shadow to it, shadow, and then mx auto to keep it in the center. I want to give it a width of 50 and then a margin top of 5. Okay, let me get rid of the container because it wouldn't take any effect on it. So next I'm going to create a form. I don't need the action for now. And then inside the form I can just specify some fields I want, maybe full name, let me say full name, last name, subjects, and then maybe message and then a submit button, just to explain how the form validation works and then how we can use the built-in classes for the input fields in the Angular and also for the form tag itself. Alright, so from the MD Bootstrap you can just expand this. Okay, let me even add it here. So when you expand it here, you can close off the getting started. They have forms. So you can expand the forms, then you choose input fields. So they'll give you a range of input fields. So you just choose the one you prefer. They have a lot of them here. So you choose the one you prefer. You click on show code and then you just copy the code and then use that in your project. Okay. So for me, I'm not going to be using that. So I just want to have a row inside this and then call maybe LG6. And I want to also add a margin top of 3 to that. Okay, so now this means I want to have one column for maybe full name or maybe first name, one column for last name in that order. So I'm going to use the input tag and then by default the Bootstrap has this class form control. And then let me add a placeholder here. Let me set this to first name. And then I'm making this field a required field. So let me copy paste this here. So I'll have last name, and then I'll need a subject. So let me make this thing 12 and change this to probably subject. And then lastly, I'm going to have a text area. So let me just duplicate this. So for text area, I don't have to use the input field. So text area, you can make the columns 4, and then you can delete these attributes. So you can get rid of the name attribute for now. Okay, and then here I'll need to make this also required. Then I'll need a placeholder for it. So leave as a message, and then I'll add a bootstrap class to it, form hyphen control. All right, then lastly, I can add a button to submit. So I'm going to put the button after the row div. So if I click here, you see where that div ends. So I'm going to add it below here. So button, and then let me say submit. Okay. So since I'm using Bootstrap, I can style the button without adding any CSS. So let me use the primary here. All right. So now let me run my Angular server here. So let me quickly explain this and then clear the screen. All right. So anytime you run this ngServe, then you get this error. It means that you are outside an Angular project. You always have to be inside an Angular project before you'll be able to run your server. So anytime you are done creating your project, you have to cd into the project folder. Let me do dir to see the folder name here, form validation. All right. So you do cd the project name. So in this case, we have form validation. So any project you have created, you have to make sure you cd into that project before you'll be able to run your server. So I'm adding the -o flag here to open the browser when it is done compiling everything. But then the command is ngServe. That's the command to run your server. The -o flag just opens your default browser when it is done compiling everything. So it just gives you some time to just generate the browser bundles and then run. Okay. So now we have the form here. So let me even add some paddings around it to make it nicer. So inside here, let me give it a P of 4. Let me see. All right, that's fine. And then for the button, I can add a margin top of 3. So here I added a padding of 4 to all the sides so that I have spaces around them. And then for the button, I'm adding a margin top of 3 to it so that I can just space out. Because of the MD Bootstrap, it uses the material design. It doesn't use the normal CSS. So if you use material design, notice this Bootstrap has some feel of the material design in it. Okay. So let me make this method maybe a post. Okay. All right. So for now, we have our normal HTML form without any validation. So the Angular has some built-in classes we can use to do validations on the input fields here. Okay. So before we do that, we need to make use. Let me even delete this. We need to make use of the reference variables. So to create a reference variable, we use an hashtag. So I can put an hashtag here. That's the reference variable. So hashtag followed by the variable name. So let me just call this sign up form. Okay. Then I'm going to assign this variable to engine form. The moment I add the engine form to this, is going to add a different feature or view or classes to our Angular project here. Okay. And then let me just add a click event to this button. I want to show how those classes work. So this click event, let me just say submit message. And then I'm going to pass the submit button, the submit form variable to it. Okay. So we are having this error because this message is not defined inside the TS file for this component. Okay. So this is the file app.component.ts. I need to create the function here before that error will go away. Okay. So inside this class, I'm just going to create the function here. Then I'm going to log, let me just make this one, let me say data. Okay. And then let me log the data here. So let me just make it any because it needs a type. So let me just make it any. So console log data any. Okay, so here you can just right click in your browser, then you choose inspect. So when you choose inspect, then you click on your console. All right, so now if I submit the form, if I click on the submit button, we have something here in our console. So we have ng form, and then this is what we need. We need the form. So if you expand the form, you can see we have controls here, and then the controls is empty. We don't have any controls here. All right, so the controls are the input fields you have. So you have to add another attribute called the name attribute to our input fields. The moment you add the name attribute to your input fields, then they are going to show in the controls here. All right, so I'll go back to the HTML file, then I'll add the name attribute to it. So I'm going to call this first underscore name. Then I also have to assign this to ng model. So I'm going to create a new variable called first name. Then I'll assign it to ng model. Then you have to add the ng model to the input field itself. So ng model like this. And then from there, I can create another one for the last name. So last underscore name. Then I'll create a variable last underscore name. Then I'll assign it to ng model as well. Then add the ng model directive here. So ng model. Then hashtag, let me create another variable for the subject. I'll assign it to the ng model and then ng model here. So I'll do same for the message hashtag message, and I'll assign it to ng model, and I'll add the ng model to it. All right, so now let me go back to the browser. Let me see ng model, ng model. Okay, so now if I click on the button, if I click on the submit button here, let me expand what we have in our console here. So you can also expand the form, and now for the controls you can see the attributes we added. So we now have the first name, we have the last name attributes. Let me expand the other fields, subjects, ng model. Okay, so the moment we add the name attribute to it, it's supposed to show, yeah, so name, so this will be subject, and then the name attribute for the message, so name message. That's why we don't have it in the console. All right, so if I click on the submit button here again, now let me expand again, and then inside the controls we now have all the fields here, so first name, last name, message, and then the subjects. Okay, so now let me click on the inspect element here, and then click on any of the input fields. So you can see Angular has added some new classes here: ng untouched, ng pristine, ng invalid. Okay, so these are the classes we'll be using for the validation. So if you touch any input field, it will just change to touch, means the user touched it. And then ng invalid will also tell you if the form is not valid. Because we made all the fields required, and then the user hasn't added any value here, we just get the ng invalid. And then if you touch the input field, you have the ng touch class here. Okay, so these are the classes we'll be using for the validation. All right, and then we also have same for the form itself. So if any of the input fields here are not yet filled, then we are going to get the same ng invalid class. Okay, so the first validation I'm going to do, so here I can just take, okay, let me even take the click event here, because I'll be using the ngSubmit event to submit a form, not the click. Okay, so you can change here to ngSubmit instead of using the click. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to disable the button if the form is not valid. So to do that, I'm just going to use this property binding here. And then all the HTML fields already have the disabled attributes. So this, since the disabled is a property, you are going to use a square bracket for that. All right, so if it is true, if the output is true, then it's going to disable the button. So you can see the color is grayed out. But then if it is false, then users will be able to click on the button. Okay, so you now have to toggle this automatically. You can't manually be adding this class. So you can use the submit form variable for that. Okay, so it has an attribute called valid, but this is not what we want. We want to only disable it if the form is not valid. So if the form is not valid, we are going to get a true. If the form is valid, we are going to get a false. So let me quickly show that in the terminal. So let me just take this off again. All right, so now let me just submit the form here, and then I'll choose. Okay, let me even expand this from the form. Expand. Okay, so here you can see we have status invalid. It means that the required fields are not yet filled. So that's what I'm using there. Okay, so let me just bring it back. So you only disable the button if the form is not valid. That's why I have the exclamation here, not valid. Okay, so if the form is not valid, it just disables the submit button. Okay, so now for the input fields, I can add some classes just to make it nice. So let me just open the app.component.css. So inside the app.component.css, I want to be adding some classes to the input fields if they are not valid. So for the input field, and then we have the engine invalid. So the class I displayed. So if the form is not valid, I want to change the border color to maybe red. So let me just do 1 pixel solid red. And then Bootstrap has some box shadows. So let me just do none and then important. All right. So let me go back to the browser. So you can see all the input fields are now red. But when I type any value, then the red goes away. Okay. So it means that the user has to touch the input field before we add the border. If the border is by default red, it doesn't make your program nice. So you can just show the invalid class if the user touches the input field. Okay, so they also have the class engine touched. All right, so let me see. So now you only show if the user touches and then clicks outside. Okay, but if you fill in the form, you are good to go. So here, if I also touch and then untouch, it will give me an error if the field is not valid. Okay, so here let me just enter valid so we don't have the output there. So if you take the content away, then you get the ng invalid class. Okay, all right. So now the next thing we do is to just apply the same thing to the text area because I was adding it directly to the input field. So I'm just going to duplicate this code and change this to text area so that the property will also be applied to the text area. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is to just show the user some messages. So if the user clicks on the first name and then clicks outside without filling the first name there, then we tell the user maybe first name is required. You can do same for the last name is required. Same for the subject and then the text area if it is a required field. Okay, so inside the HTML file, I'm just going to use a span tag here. So span, and let me say first name is required. Okay, all right, so that's fine. So I will later use CSS to change the span classes, the span tag to red. Okay, and then let me do same for this. So span last name is required. Then I can repeat same for the subject. So let me use the span tag here. Then subject is required. And lastly, I'll do for the text area. So span and then message is required. All right, so now here we have the messages here, but we only want to show the message if the user touches the input fields and then touches outside. So when the input field is valid, we don't have to see the error message here. Okay. So let me quickly start this in the CSS file. So I'm just changing the color of all the span tag to red. So the span tag, I'm making the color red. So now we have red below. Okay. So the next thing we will do is to not to show the message or the error messages here. We will only show it if the user touches the input fields and then clicks outside. Alright. So here we need to use the ngIf. So ngIf, so this is how we make conditions in the Angular. So ngIf, then you have to use the variable name you created here. ngIf the form is not valid. So if the first name is not, so I'll just bring an exclamation there. So if first name is not valid, so that's why I have the exclamation here. I'll just give you the inverse of it. So if the first name is not valid, I get the error. But then if I type, it means it is valid, so it will go away. Okay. But I also don't want to show the message here. We want to only show it if the user has clicked in and then clicked outside. Okay. So I'm just going to use the end here, which just makes sure that both conditions are true. So if the form is not valid, and then the user has touched the first name, okay, so we now don't have the message here. We'll only show if the user has touched and then click outside without filling the required details there. Okay, so I'm just going to replicate the same for the other input fields. So engine, if the last name, let me just write it here. If the last name is not valid and the user has touched the last name field, so last name dot touched. All right, and then same for the subject engine. If the subject is not valid and the user has touched the subject, so subject dot touched. And then lastly for the message engine, if the message is not valid and the user has touched the message field, so message dot touched. All right, I think that will be all for this. So let me quickly try. So first name not touched, not touched. Okay, so we have now successfully implemented the form validation here. So first name, say Mike, last name Smith. Let me just use the name here. So here, Donzi, here we have tech. And then here, I can say maybe form validation. And then here I can add form validation by Donzi tech. Alright, so the button gets activated when the user fills the required details. Alright, so I can just add one last attribute here so that when the user submits the form, you can see the details in your browser console. So to do that, I'll just go back to the TS file, and then the form has an attribute called value. So value is just what the user will enter. They are going to have the details in the form of an object. So here, the same thing, let me do Donzi, and then here tech, let me write forms validation. So form validation in Angular by Donzi tech. All right, so submit. Then we have the details here. So we have the first name, the last name, the message, and then the subject. Okay, so if you have any questions regarding the form validation in the Angular, you can leave that in the comment section below. And then also if you have any video you wish I work on that for you, you can also leave that also in the comment section. And then if you are new to the channel, you kindly subscribe and then like the video. You can also share this on your social media platforms or with friends for them to also get to know about the Angular and the cool stuff we have in Angular.